September the 12th, 2017. A family from Meolo, near Venice, spends a Tuesday afternoon at a crater outside Naples. The father is 45. The mother is 42. Their sons are 11 and 7. The site is called Solfatara. It is a shallow bowl of pale ground that hisses steam and smells of rotten eggs. Visitors have walked here since 1900. A rope marks where they are meant to stop. On this particular afternoon, after days of heavy rain, the 11-year-old boy crosses it. Ground that held tourists for over a century gives way beneath him. His father goes in after him. His mother goes in after his father. The 7-year-old stands at the edge, then runs for help. Within minutes, 3 members of one family are gone. A cafe owner working steps from the crater later tells reporters something simple. In 40 years by that spot, he had never seen anything like it. Investigators are still not certain what killed them. Scalding mud, toxic gas, or both together. What is certain is this. The ground that opened under a child had done nothing unusual by the volcano's own standards. It was breathing, the way it always breathes. Nobody pictures Solfatara when they think of Italian volcanoes. They picture a cone across the bay, the mountain that buried Pompeii, a silhouette printed on postcards and t-shirts. That mountain is Vesuvius. It is not the one that killed this family. It is not the one that has lifted Pozzuoli by 1.5 meters since 2005. It is not the one 4 scientists flagged in April of 2026. They call it a critical transition. That volcano has a different name, Campi Flegrei, the Phlegrean Fields. It sits 5 kilometers west of Vesuvius, on the far side of the same bay, 12 kilometers by 15. Much of it is underwater. The rest lies buried beneath the western suburbs of Naples. At least 24 craters sit inside its boundary. Several of them sit under city streets. Pozzuoli's historic center stands directly above the point of maximum uplift. Baccoli, Quarto, and parts of Naples itself sit inside the same ring. None of these towns look like they are standing on an active caldera. They look like ordinary Italian coastal towns, with scooters, laundry lines, and cats on windowsills. That is the first thing to understand about Campi Flegrei. It never announces itself the way a mountain does. There is no peak to point a camera at. There is only a wide, low landscape of craters, lakes, and fumaroles, quietly doing something no other volcano on Earth is known to do in quite the same way. 2 of the caldera's other craters have become ordinary weekend destinations today. Astroni, a forested crater a few kilometers from Pozzuoli, is now a nature reserve. Trails wind through it, managed in part by the World Wildlife Fund, full of birdwatchers. Lake Averno, the very lake the Romans once mistook for an entrance to the underworld, now hosts lakeside restaurants. Sunday walkers circle it without a second thought. Neither site carries any visible warning about what lies underneath it. Both sit inside the same boundary Italy's own emergency planners have drawn as a pyroclastic flow hazard zone. The Greeks who settled this coast in the 8th century before our era already had a name for it, Phlegraios. It means burning. They placed the entrance to the underworld a few kilometers away at Lake Avernus. Birds were said to drop dead flying over its toxic vapors. The Sibyl of Cumae, the region's most famous oracle, spoke her prophecies from a tunnel. It was carved into this same volcanic ground. Nearby, at Lake Lucrino, Roman engineers later built part of their imperial war fleet's harbor. They had no idea the lake sat on ground that would one day rise and swallow it. None of these people had seismographs. None of them had satellites. They had something else. They had noticed, over generations, that the Earth here behaved differently than the Earth anywhere nearby. They built a mythology to hold that observation. Modern instruments have since confirmed what the myth was pointing at, without ever using the word volcano. 2,000 years after the Sibyl, geologists working far from Naples found something strange buried in the seafloor. Drilling into sediment beneath the Ionian Sea, they hit a thin band of pale volcanic ash. The same band turned up at the bottom of Lake Monticchio in southern Italy. It turned up in cores from the Black Sea. It turned up in caves in Romania and on the Russian plain, thousands of kilometers to the northeast. One ash, one eruption. Chemical analysis of the glass shards inside it matched a single source on the entire planet, Campi Flegrei. Italian researcher Francesco Fedele of Naples's Federico II University was among the first to ask the obvious follow-up question. If one eruption's ash reached from the Mediterranean to the Ural Mountains, how powerful was the source that produced it? The answer arrived through decades of dating work. About 39,000 years ago, Campi Flegrei produced the eruption now known as the Campanian ignimbrite. Volcanologists rank it 7 on an 8-point explosivity scale. It is the largest eruption Europe has experienced in the past 200,000 years. Pyroclastic flows, a scalding mixture of gas and ash, moved at roughly 200 kilometers per hour. They crossed ridgelines over a kilometer high. They swept across the Bay of Naples and scorched the Sorrentine Peninsula 40 kilometers from the source. Sulfur dioxide, measured in the hundreds of millions of tons, punched into the stratosphere. This was not simply an explosion. It was a machine for switching off sunlight across a continent. Within a few years, average temperatures along the Iberian coast dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In parts of what is now western Russia, the drop reached 9 degrees. Climatologists call the cold spell that followed Heinrich Event 4. This is where the story turns genuinely contested. The same window of time, roughly 40,000 years ago, marks something else too. The final disappearance of Neanderthals from the European fossil record. Fedele and several colleagues argue the connection is not a coincidence. Their case is straightforward. A volcanic winter of this scale would have stripped hunting grounds bare for years. A population already living near the edge might never recover from that bottleneck. Antonio Costa, a senior researcher at Italy's National Geophysics Institute, disagrees. He points out that Neanderthals were already retreating, under pressure from arriving Homo sapiens. The eruption's cooling, while severe, lasted only a year or two in most climate models. It may have been the final push toward extinction. It may have had nothing to do with their disappearance at all. No consensus exists between the two camps. What both sides agree on is smaller, but just as unsettling. When Campi Flegrei runs its deepest cycle, the damage is never only local. It is continental. After the Campanian ignimbrite, the volcano fell silent for roughly 24,000 years. Then it erupted again, weaker, but still catastrophic. This eruption formed what geologists now call the Neapolitan yellow tuff about 15,000 years ago. It built the inner caldera the modern city sits inside today, the one where Pozzuoli now stands. After that, quiet, for thousands of years. People moved back onto this ground. They built a port, then an empire. They quietly assumed the volcano had finished with them. Then, in 1502, a fisherman working the coast near Pozzuoli noticed something odd. If investigations like this one interest you, subscribing costs nothing, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. The spot where he usually tied up his boat now stood above the waterline. The sea, in other words, appeared to be retreating, not because of any storm or tide, because the land underneath it was slowly rising. No earthquakes, no noise, just a silent lift, centimeter by centimeter, month after month. Nobody in 1502 had any framework to explain it. 36 years later, the story turned violent. From the spring of 1534, tremors returned to the area around Pozzuoli. Rare at first, then constant. Homeowners abandoned cracking buildings near the shore. On September the 28th, 1538, roughly 20 distinct tremors were felt in a single day, from dawn until dusk. The ground was no longer merely shaking. It was visibly swelling. Near the medieval village of Trippergol, the surface reportedly rose by several meters within about 48 hours. On the evening of September the 29th, a dark column burst out of that swollen ground. The eruption ran for 8 days, until October the 6th. By the time it stopped, enough material had come out of the earth to build an entirely new mountain. Roughly 123 meters high, its base nearly 1.5 kilometers wide. Locals gave it a name that has stuck for almost 500 years. Monte Nuovo, New Mountain. A Florentine merchant named Marco Antonio degli Falconi happened to be in Naples that evening. Weeks later, he wrote a detailed letter to the Marchioness della Padula, describing exactly what he had watched. That letter, alongside roughly 24 other contemporary accounts, became something rare. one of the first scientifically useful records of a volcanic eruption in European history. Not legend, not myth, a real timeline. What time it began, what burned, what it smelled like, how loud it was. The medieval village of Trippergol, which had stood on that exact spot for centuries, vanished within hours. 24 people died in the eruption's final phase. Not residents who had already fled days earlier. Curious onlookers who climbed the cooling cone during a lull and were caught by one last violent burst. Campi Flegrei then went quiet again. It has not erupted since. In 2016, researchers at Italy's National Geophysics Institute reconstructed the final 48 hours before Monte Nuovo. What happened underground, hour by hour? Magma moved from a deep reservoir into a shallower chamber, roughly 3.8 kilometers down. From there, into a pocket closer to the surface. Then out. Now compare that history to what the instruments record today. As of late March 2026, the ground beneath Rione Terra has risen by roughly 1 meter and 63 centimeters. All of it since 2005. That figure comes directly from Italy's Department of Civil Protection. In 1536, the ground near the future crater rose by close to 19 meters in about 2 years. An order of magnitude faster than today's rate. The scale is not yet comparable. The mechanism is the same. One detail from 1502 lines up almost exactly with what is happening now. The land started rising quietly, 36 years before it finally broke open. We are currently somewhere around year 21 of a phase that began in 2005. The instruments recording that figure sit inside a place with its own unsettling history. Rione Terra is the oldest quarter of Pozzuoli. Greek colonists from Samos founded it in the 6th century before our era. Rome absorbed it as the colony of Puteoli in 194 before our era. People lived there without a real break for roughly 2,000 years. Then came March 2nd, 1970. Uplift of about 1 meter and 70 centimeters had already cracked buildings across the district. Authorities ordered a complete evacuation. Army trucks rolled through the narrow streets. Officials went door to door, clearing residents out within days. The municipality seized the buildings outright. Almost nobody was ever allowed to move back in, apart from the local bishop. The eruption everyone feared that year never came. Rione Terra stayed empty anyway, for over 30 years, a genuine ghost town above an active bay. Restoration began in the 1990s. The district reopened, partially, to visitors in 2014. Underneath its narrow lanes, archaeologists found an entire Roman city, preserved almost intact by decades of abandonment nobody had wanted. Tourists now walk those Roman streets directly above the exact spot where instruments track the caldera's uplift, centimeter by centimeter. The ghost town and the measuring station share the same hill. 5 centuries of silence after Monte Nuovo is, in one sense, an illusion. The volcano never actually stopped working. It simply switched modes, from violent uplift to a slow, patient sinking. This time, the casualty was not a single village. It was an entire Roman city. 4 kilometers west of Pozzuoli, along the same coast, sits a modest harbor town called Baia today. Nothing about it hints at what stood there 2,000 years ago. In antiquity, this was Baia, considered the single most expensive resort address in the Roman Empire. Ahead of Capri, ahead of Pompeii, Roman emperors, including Julius Caesar and Nero, competed with one another to build villas along this shoreline. By the 3rd century of our era, Baia was almost one unbroken strip. Marble colonnades, mosaic floors, and domed bathhouses running along the coast. Then the volcano, without producing a single flow of lava, quietly took it all back. Starting around the 4th century, the sea appeared to rise along this stretch of coast. In reality, the land itself was sinking beneath it. First, the lower steps of porticos flooded. Then the courtyards. Then entire mosaic floors. Then whole villas slipped beneath the waterline, one after another. No eruption. No ash. No warning anyone at the time could name or measure. Just millimeters accumulating year after year. Within roughly 2 centuries, the most expensive resort in the Roman world had settled below sea level. Most of it still sits there today, at depths between 5 and 15 meters. Divers now visit the submerged remains of a villa belonging to the Piso family. Its marble floor is still largely intact. Glass-bottom boats pass over a sunken forum. In April of 2023, archaeologists found yet another villa nobody had known was there. It was decorated with hexagonal mosaic patterns, sealed under sediment for over a millennium. The strangest proof of this slow drowning stands not underwater, but on dry land, in the center of Pozzuoli itself. 3 marble columns from an ancient Roman market still stand near the harbor today. They were long misidentified as a temple to the god Serapis. About midway up each column, a band of small holes runs around the marble, bored by a saltwater mollusk called lithodomus. Those creatures only bore into stone, sitting underwater. The columns prove something in a single glance. This exact spot sank below the sea for centuries, then rose back above it, all without a single recorded eruption. Geologists consider it the most famous physical evidence of ground deformation anywhere in the volcanic world. The mechanism behind all of it, Baia's drowning and the Serapis columns alike, is called Predictive, from Greek words meaning slow movement. The Phlegreian ground rises, then falls, then rises again, driven by pressure changes in the hydrothermal and magmatic systems underneath. In the 5 centuries since Monte Nuovo, the cumulative swing has topped 4 meters in either direction. From the 3rd century onward, this process has not stopped once. Only its direction has changed, over and over. Baia, seen from underwater today, illustrates an uncomfortable idea. Campi Flegrei does not simply switch between dormant and erupting. It has a 3rd state, and that state has now lasted roughly 2,000 years. Ask most people to name Italy's dangerous volcano, and they will say Vesuvius, correctly enough. Vesuvius destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum in the year 79. It remains fully capable of doing something similar again. But Vesuvius behaves the way people expect a volcano to behave. It has a summit. It either sleeps or it erupts. Campi Flegrei follows no such rule. There is no summit to watch. There is a whole city, breathing. How do you evacuate a metropolitan region built inside a caldera, rather than beside a single mountain? How much warning does a slowly sinking city actually get before it becomes a fast one? Who decided that 72 hours is enough time to move 500,000 people to safety? And what happens if the ground's next move is not the one anyone modeled for? The rest of this comes down to 3 threads. What the instruments underneath Pozzuoli are recording right now. What 4 scientists concluded from that data in a paper released in April of 2026. And what Italy's evacuation plan can and cannot honestly promise the people living above all of it. Since 1848, historians have documented episodes of unrest on this same patch of ground, roughly once or twice a generation. 1950 to 1952 brought about 70 centimeters of uplift in 2 years. The crisis that reintroduced modern instruments to Pozzuoli after 4 centuries of calm, 1969 to 1972, brought nearly 1.75 meters. Bridges and wharves along the waterfront visibly deformed. 1982 to 1984 was the most violent modern episode. Roughly 1 meter and 80 centimeters of uplift in under 2 years. Over 16,000 earthquakes recorded. Somewhere between 36 and 40,000 residents evacuated from downtown Pozzuoli, many never to return to their original homes. Each episode ended without an eruption. Each one also left the crust measurably weaker than it found it. That is according to researchers who have modeled the cumulative strain. Christopher Kilburn of University College London describes it simply. Every emergency stretches the crust a little further. Later emergencies build directly on top of the ones before them. Underneath Pozzuoli, researchers have mapped 2 connected reservoirs feeding this pattern. A deeper one, roughly 2 to 4.5 kilometers down. Magmatic fluids accumulate there as deep magma slowly crystallizes and releases gas. A shallower one sits nearer the surface, sealed beneath a layer of marine sediment. That layer traps pressure, the way a lid traps steam over a pot. When fluid and gas push upward faster than the lid can vent them, the ground above swells. Much like dough rising when trapped gas has nowhere else to escape. Rainfall adds roughly 1/5 of the total swelling in wet years, soaking downward and adding its own weight. Crack that lid open, even briefly, through a fault or a fresh fracture. and the pressure finds a way out. Sometimes as an earthquake, sometimes as a burst of gas at Solfatara, occasionally, across this volcano's much longer history, as an eruption. Every month, Italy's Civil Protection Department holds a call with the scientists monitoring all of this. 4 alert levels exist: green, yellow, orange, and red. Campi Flegrei has sat at yellow, meaning attention, since 2012. That single word, unchanged for over a decade, carries most of the tension in this story. Not calm enough to ignore. Not alarming enough to act on, at least not by evacuating anyone yet. Rome has already moved once, formally, on paper. Earthquakes of magnitude 4.2 and 4.0 struck that September 27th and October 2nd, 2023. In response, the government passed Decree Law Number 140, urgent measures for seismic risk tied to bradyseism in the Phlegreian fields. Parliament converted it into law that December. The decree carved out a smaller, more urgent zone inside the wider red zone. It was based purely on how far the ground had already moved. It covers roughly 33,600 people, just under 7,000 buildings spread across Pozzuoli, Boccoli, and part of Naples. Residents there can now request a free structural inspection of their own homes. A magnitude 4.6 earthquake struck in March of 2025. Afterward, the government ordered a national mobilization of civil protection resources. Officials have since run repeated evacuation drills, including one that emptied 4 separate school buildings as a live rehearsal. None of this activity means an eruption is close. It means Rome no longer treats the ground beneath Pozzuoli as a background curiosity. On April the 28th, 2026, 4 researchers posted a paper to the physics preprint server arXiv. The authors, Davide Zaccagnino, a geohazards researcher tied to Italy's National Geophysics Institute and a risk center in China. Physicist Didier Sornette, known for applying failure prediction models from engineering to complex natural systems, and Antonio Giovanni Iaccarino and Matteo Picozzi, both of Naples' Federico II University. Their title states the conclusion plainly. Accelerating unrest at Campi Flegrei signals a critical transition within the next decade. Zaccagnino has compared the underlying idea to a stressed pane of glass. Under slow, steady pressure, glass bends for a long time without any visible change. Then, in a fraction of a second, it snaps. The moment of failure can often be estimated well in advance, purely from how the rate of bending itself changes over time. The team fed 3 independent data streams into exactly that kind of model: ground uplift, earthquake frequency, carbon dioxide output from the fumaroles at Solfatara and nearby Pisciarelli. 3 separate instruments, 3 unrelated physical quantities, measured entirely independently of one another. They asked a single question: where does each curve, projected forward, converge? All 3 pointed toward the same narrow window, the early 2030s, with a central estimate landing somewhere between 2030 and 2034. In physics, this pattern carries a specific name: a finite time singularity, a system accelerating toward its own limit rather than growing at a steady, predictable rate. If the current trend holds without interruption, the paper estimates uplift could reach roughly 4 meters by the early 2030s. Critically, the paper does not claim an eruption is coming by that date. It states something narrower and more careful. By then, if trends continue unchanged, the crust will likely cross a mechanical threshold, one whose outcome remains genuinely undetermined. 3 outcomes stay on the table in the author's own framing: stronger earthquakes with no magma reaching the surface at all, a structural reorganization of the crust with new fault patterns forming deep underground, or, in the most severe scenario, volcanic material finally breaching the surface after nearly 500 years. Christopher Kilburn, who was not involved in writing the study, offered his own blunt summary. "Things are changing," he said. "Past experience is not necessarily a good guide to the future." A separate line of research complicates any rush toward conclusions in a genuinely useful way. In September of 2025, Stanford doctoral student Xing Tan published a study in the journal Science. He worked with geophysicist Gregory Barroza and colleagues at Italy's Geophysics Institute. Using a retrained machine learning system, the team reanalyzed roughly 3 years of seismic recordings. They expanded the known earthquake catalog from about 12,000 events to more than 54,000. The added detail revealed a sharply defined ring fault circling the caldera, far clearer than anyone had previously mapped it. Tan later said the Italian side of the team was genuinely startled. The ring appeared so cleanly once the AI model finished its pass. The study delivered one more result, a reassuring one, alongside the alarming detail. The team found no direct signature of magma migrating upward through the crust. No seismic activity at all below about 4 kilometers depth. In plain terms, the volcano is unmistakably under mounting stress. What that stress is actually preparing for remains, for now, invisible to the instruments watching it most closely. William Ellsworth, who co-directs Stanford's Center for Induced and Triggered Seismicity, put a number on what that stress could still produce. An earthquake in the magnitude 5 range, he said, is not out of the question. The research itself was a three-way collaboration. Stanford supplied the machine learning framework. Italy's National Geophysics Institute supplied the raw seismic archive. The University of Naples Federico II supplied local expertise on the ground. Berosa described the improvement in plain terms. Watching the old data, he said, was like looking through a blurry lens. The new method brought the picture into focus for the first time. None of that focus, though, changes what the instruments still cannot see. A magnitude 5 earthquake, on ground already carrying 4 centuries of cumulative strain, would test buildings never designed for it. None of this makes daily life in Pozzuoli feel like an emergency. Mornings there look like mornings in any Italian coastal town. Fishermen unload the previous night's catch. Tourists photograph Vesuvius across the bay, rarely realizing what sits beneath their own feet instead. Streets climb from the harbor past laundry lines and cats sunning themselves on windowsills. Families picnic on the wooded slopes of Monte Nuovo itself, now a quiet nature reserve. The damage from recent swarms is not abstract, though. Giovanni Macedonio, director of Italy's National Geophysics Institute in Naples, has said something telling. Earthquakes in March and June of 2025 forced residents from their homes. Tens of families, in his own words, still cannot return because of structural damage the tremors left behind. Maddalena Desario, a Naples resident whose neighborhood sits on the caldera's rim, put it simply to a visiting reporter. Everyone here knows they live in a fully seismic area. A local artist named Pina Testa keeps a studio in Pozzuoli's old quarter. She paints eruptions in bright, almost celebratory colors, ash plumes rendered like fireworks. Asked why, she offers no dramatic answer. It is simply the landscape she has always lived inside. But the infrastructure underneath that ordinary daily life has been built around one specific fact. This ground has been officially classified as high seismic risk since 1981, with construction codes written to match. Italy's Department of Civil Protection has drawn 2 zones around the caldera. Inside the red zone, roughly 481,000 people would need to leave before any eruption. That figure includes about 286,000 people inside Naples's own city limits. Pyroclastic flows leave almost no time to react once they start moving. That is why evacuation, not shelter, is the only listed protective measure. Inside the wider yellow zone, ash fallout is the main threat. It covers a further 840,000 residents beyond the red zone's edge. The plan itself runs in 2 phases. A pre-alarm phase, which could last months or even years, during which residents may choose to leave on their own. An alarm phase, triggered only if monitoring shows imminent danger. During the alarm phase, the entire red zone population must be moved out within 72 hours. By bus, train, ferry, and private car, people move toward twinned regions across Italy, regions that have already agreed in advance to receive them. Naples ran a full-scale test of parts of this system in 2019 in an exercise called Campi Flegrei. Officials used the results to reshape several evacuation routes afterward. Here is a fact that sits uneasily next to that plan. Engineers have surveyed more than 12,700 residential buildings across the caldera in recent years. Roughly half of them fall into the 2 highest seismic vulnerability categories the survey uses. A moderate to strong earthquake alone, with no eruption involved at all, could do real damage. It could leave a significant share of Pozzuoli's housing stock unsafe to occupy. The evacuation plan largely assumes intact roads and standing buildings along its routes. The buildings themselves offer no such guarantee. And then there is a danger that requires no critical transition, no 2033 window, no preprint at all. Solfatara's main fumarole vent steam measured above 160 degrees Celsius every single day. Whether the caldera happens to be quiet or accelerating makes no difference to it. It has done this for roughly 700 years without any dramatic change in intensity. That is exactly what took the family from Meolo in 2017. Ordinary background behavior, the kind this volcano performs constantly and without ceremony, killed 3 people. No eruption was required at all. Since that day, the crater itself has stayed closed to general visitors. Tours of the wider Campi Flegrei area still continue around it. Zoom out, and the numbers only stack further. Roughly 500,000 people inside the strict red zone. Another 840,000 inside the surrounding yellow zone. Greater Naples, sitting partly within both boundaries, holds well over 3 million residents in total. That makes Campi Flegrei's exposed population larger than that of almost any other caldera-type volcano on Earth. Italy's civil protection authorities currently estimate the odds at roughly 19 in 20 that any future eruption, should one actually happen, lands on the smaller, more moderate end of the scale. That still leaves a real, if smaller, chance of something far worse. For a child born in Pozzuoli this year, the critical window identified in the 2026 preprint arrives early, before that child even finishes elementary school. One detail makes today's phase of unrest genuinely different from every prior cycle in the caldera's recorded history. Continuous satellite monitoring did not exist in 1538. Dense seismic networks did not exist in 1984. Machine learning tools, like the one Xingtan's team built, did not exist even 10 years ago. The instruments doing all this watching sit inside the Vesuvius Observatory, founded in 1841. It is the oldest volcano observatory anywhere in the world. It has outlasted kingdoms, 2 world wars, and every prior bradyseismic cycle it has ever recorded. A separate study, published in 2026 in the journal Remote Sensing, took a different approach to the same data. Rather than searching for one future critical point, it looked backward for moments the system had already crossed a threshold. It flagged 2, November the 30th, 2020, and April the 1st, 2023. Both dates sit inside the same broader acceleration the April preprint would later describe. Different authors, different mathematics. The same underlying pattern confirmed twice over from 2 separate directions. For the first time in this volcano's long relationship with the people above it, something is different. Scientists are watching a possible pre-eruptive phase unfold in something close to real time. Werner Marzocchi, a geophysicist at Naples' Federico II University, studies the caldera's risk directly. He has put the field's honest limitation as plainly as anyone can. Understanding exactly what is driving this unrest, he has said, remains the single biggest open question, even with this much data now pouring in every week. Every generation that has lived on this coast assumed the ground it was born onto had always been solid. The Romans who built Baia's marble bathhouses did not know they were building on a slope that would eventually submerge their descendants' entire town. The residents of Tripergole in 1538 did not know their village stood on the exact spot where a mountain would grow whole in 8 days. The family that visited Solfatara in 2017 did not know one thing: that the ground beneath a public tourist path could open like a trapdoor. None of them were reckless. They were simply living where people have always lived on this stretch of coast, above a caldera that has never fully announced what it plans to do beneath them next. Roughly 360,000 people in and around Pozzuoli went to sleep tonight, the same as any other night. The instruments inside the Vesuvius Observatory did not sleep. Whatever 3 converging data streams pointed toward on April the 28th, 2026, did not sleep either. Nobody currently knows whether Campi Flegrei erupts before this decade ends. That uncertainty is not a gap in the science. It may be the most honest thing the science has to offer right now. The real question was never really about lava. It is about a coastline that has been rising and sinking quietly for roughly 2,000 years. And a city built directly on top of that rhythm, hoping it never changes tempo without warning. If investigations like this one are useful to you, the subscribe button costs nothing. It genuinely helps this channel keep making them. The ground under Pozzuoli has been speaking in centimeters for 21 years now. The only real question left is whether anyone will still be listening closely enough.